Hi everyone, thank you for joining. We're just waiting on a few more participants to join the workshop, so we will kick things off in a couple of minutes at 2 minutes past. Okay, welcome everyone who's joined, and as people continue to join, I think we will get going in the interest of time. Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining the first in a series of workshops hosted by the Social Impact Hub, part of the RISE program, a program designed to support social enterprises and for-purpose organisations with the effects of COVID-19, and is kindly supported by the Westpac Foundation and Paul Ramsay Foundation. Before we start, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we meet today. For me, that's the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and I'd like to pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging, as well as extend this more broadly, acknowledging collectively that we're dialing in from a range of locations today. My name is Rob, and alongside my colleague Jess Liang and the broader team at Social Impact Hub, we've had the privilege of working with a range of fantastic people and organisations in the for-purpose sector and beyond in the development of this series of workshops. So it's a real pleasure to be starting these with you all today. Before we kick off, just a couple of housekeeping items. Please mute your microphone whilst Tiffany is presenting. There'll be opportunities to collaborate later on in the session. If you have any comments or questions, please share them in the chat, and Jess and myself will do the best to collate some of those for the Q&As later on. And finally, if possible, turn on your camera so we can see all your lovely faces. And if there's anyone having technical challenges, please drop either myself or Jess a line. We should be named as Social Impact Hub in the Zoom messaging list, so please drop us a line. Okay, so that's everything from me. So now it is my pleasure to introduce you to Tiphanie from the Office of Social Impact Investment, who will take us through today's session on outcomes measurement. So over to you, Tiff.
Thank you so much, Rob. Hello, everyone. My name is Tiphanie Au, and it is my pleasure to talk to you today about outcomes measurement. It is a topic that is at the heart of my day job as an Associate Director in the New South Wales Office of Social Impact Investment. And I hope what you will get out of today's session is a better understanding of outcomes measurement and how it can benefit your organisation. First, though, I also like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which we are all dialing in from. For me, that's also the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and I pay my respects to the elders past, present, and emerging. I'd also like to pass on a very warm welcome to any Aboriginal people who may be joining us today. So just to orientate ourselves, we will divide today's 90-minute session into 4 segments. First, I start by introducing the difference between output, outcome, and impact, as those terms sometimes cause confusion, and then why outcomes measurement is important. Second, we will do a deeper dive into the theory, which will cover the areas of program logic, how to design your outcome metrics, and how outcomes measurement relate to social impact investment. After that, we'll pause to take any questions from the audience. Seems to have some issues with the slides going a little bit further than I like, so going back. Any quick questions from the audience? So as I said, as Rob said, Rob and Jess will moderate and keep an eye out for your questions. So please feel free to submit your questions in the chat function at any time. In the third segment, we will break into smaller groups to work through a case study which we have sent to you in advance to give everyone an opportunity to apply some of what you've heard and learnt today into practice. We will then regroup for the final segment to answer any further questions from the audience and wrap up the session. Having worked with many for-purpose organisations in these capability building workshops, I have noticed there can be confusion around the terms output, outcomes, and impact, as some people incorrectly use, for example, outcomes and impact interchangeably, when actually they don't exactly mean the same thing. So I thought it would be useful to start the session on this particular point in getting some of the definitions out of the way. So you can think of outputs as simply the activities made by your organisation. So, for example, the meals served by a soup kitchen are outputs. Outcomes are the observed effects of the outputs on the beneficiaries, such as your clients. So the outcome of the soup kitchen example is the degree to which their meals reduce hunger in the population it serves. Impact, on the other hand, is the degree to which the outcomes observed by your organisation are attributable to its activities. So the impact in the soup kitchen example is the degree to which a reduction of hunger in the population they serve is attributable to its efforts. While a soup kitchen might serve a lot of meals and correctly observe that hunger is subsequently less prevalent in the population it serves, the reduction in hunger might simply be attributable to an improving economy or some other activities that are not part of the soup kitchen's efforts. So only a vigorous evaluation, for example, can eliminate the potential effects of outside influences to really prove the impact. So for that reason, measuring outcomes can be a lot easier than measuring impact. In fact, as you move from left to right on the screen here, the harder it is to measure and track. So from counting your outputs all the way to proving impact. But it's really important for organizations who want to know whether what they are actually doing are making a difference to begin the process of tracking the activities in some way. And that's where outcome measurement comes in. Outcomes measurement is important because it is a necessary step towards measuring and demonstrating impact that provides accountability for your stakeholders. So, for example, in my line of work, where government payments made under social impact investments are linked to achieving agreed social outcomes, measuring outcomes helps ensure transparency around how public resources are being spent and progress made towards each outcome. So for the social enterprises and for-purpose organisations who have joined us today, communicating how your program is really making a difference can help appeal to, for example, impact investors who are looking to invest in programs that derives both a social and financial return. Outcomes measurement can also inform decision-making and create a culture of learning and innovation. Ultimately, that helps drive organisational sustainability because measuring outcomes together with program evaluation, for example, can help your organization decide whether to amend, shut down, or scale your program in order to deliver better services and outcomes for your clients. More broadly, an understanding of what works and what doesn't work for different people or different contexts can contribute to broaden systems change and best practices. So outcomes measurement is really important both at an organization level, as it helps you test what you are doing, learning whether or not it is working, and then help you iterate. And at a broader system level of contributing to an evidence base of what works so that collectively we can achieve even greater impact for our community. So where do you start? So a useful tool to begin is a program logic, a term that some of you may use interchangeably with theory of change, logic model, to name a few. They all mean the same thing in the sense that they provide a visual representation, as shown in this diagram up here on the screen, to help you outline the causal relationships between the program inputs and activities and the expected outcomes and impacts you aim to achieve. It is a simple but useful tool that I encourage everyone to consider using if you haven't already, because it can help you tell the story and bring rigor and focus on the key aspects of your program and measuring its impact. So there are 5 key principles to keep in mind when constructing your program logic. The first is to define the purpose and objective of your service or intervention. Bring together any existing evidence about your proposed intervention to determine and articulate how and why it is expected to work. Next, consider how your intervention in the proposed setting is expected to have an impact. So ask yourself, what is the path from the need you are trying to address to the change you want to see achieved? Are your goals and outcomes realistic? Do the activities and intervention make sense given your goals and outcomes? And what are the assumed links between activities and outcomes? How are outcomes connected? How would progress towards your outcomes be measurably demonstrated? And what are the hidden assumptions? So based on identifying how your intervention has an impact, you then identify what should be measured to provide quantitative evidence of outputs and impact. Last but not least, identify measurable indicators that are sensitive to the activities of different actors and their outcomes. So let's go through an example together. First, starting in the yellow box up on the screen here, define the purpose and objective of your intervention or program. So ask yourself, what is the underlying issue you are trying to address? So, for example, a problem that you may be trying to solve for can be about addressing reoffending, because you believe from research that providing wraparound support services to parolees in the first 3 months after release would have a good probability of reducing reoffending. Next, moving to the red box up on the screen here, consider your program inputs. So ask yourself what goes into the intervention to enable things to happen. This can be your new service or model of care, having the right governance to support your new program, and having strong program management, monitoring, and reporting mechanisms. Then consider how the use of your activities in the blue box here can generate your desired results. So things like service delivery, training your caseworkers, for example, to implement your new model of care, and facilitating appropriate relationships with other partners to more effectively deliver on your program. The outputs in the navy box up here would be what would be delivered by the activities in the short term. So in the reoffend example, this will be the wraparound support service delivered to eligible offenders. In the grey box, the outcomes are generally the medium-term effects of the activities. So in this reoffending example, you would, for instance, expect to see a reduced reconviction rate compared to a control group. The more long-term change or impact in the aqua box, blue box at the end, would be improved community safety as a result of your program. To be clear though, there is no one way to present a program logic. The key is to make sure whatever the format or structure, it represents the program's causal links and to be able to communicate them adequately to your intended audience. So just in case this is still sounding a bit theoretical, here are two real-life examples of two programs in New South Wales. The first is the Resolve Social Impact Bond, which is a community-based program for mental health patients in the Western New South Wales, NP and Blue Mountains local health districts. The program inputs would include case coordination, residential support, and non-clinical outreach. The outputs are the intensive residential care, linkage to support services, and peer support provided to the patients, with the intended outcomes to improve the mental health of patients and a reduction in hospital care. The impact, which would be measured and determined by an independent evaluator, is better well-being and life trajectories for these people. The second example is one of our first social impact investment called NUPIN, which is an intensive program that focuses on restoring children in out-of-home care to the families. So here, the inputs are the caseworkers and referrals of the children into the program. The outputs include the therapeutic support and partners parenting group and home visits for the families. And the intended outcome would be to see an improved restoration rate of children from out-of-home care to the families compared to control group. And finally, the impact that is again determined by an independent evaluator is to see the breaking of the destructive cycle of family relationships that lead to abuse and neglect. So I hope with these examples, you can follow the thinking process in designing your program logic. No one program logic are necessarily the same, but the principles behind it in terms of setting out the causal relationships between the program inputs and activities and expected outcomes and impact you aim to achieve would be applicable. So let's move on to the specific components of measuring outcomes. If you remember at the start of this session, I've defined an outcome as the measurable and observable change in individuals, groups, communities, and organizations. Now, change can include attitudes, values, behaviors, or conditions. And these changes can be short-term, which is the most direct result of an intervention or program, typically not ends in themselves, but necessary steps towards those desired ends. Changes can also be intermediate, which is linking the intervention's short-term outcomes into long-term outcomes. And these long-term outcomes, also known as the ultimate outcomes or impacts that we want to see, are typically observed beyond the timeframe of an interventional program and usually proven through the evaluation process. Now, an outcome metric is the specific measure that is used to demonstrate the outcome. It is generally helpful to identify interim outcomes, which, depending on timeframes, are those of short to medium term. And the purpose is really to show whether progress is being made towards an overarching outcome. Whatever they are, though, we do need to find the right balance between the number of metrics or indicators that will provide us with sufficient coverage and ensuring accurate measurement. The focus should remain on the issue or problem we're trying to solve and not get too lost in the details. In designing your outcome metric, the acronym to remember is ROCS, which really stands for relevant, objective, collectible, and simple. Your outcome metric should be relevant and specifically related to the outcome you're trying to demonstrate. It should be objective because it's not very valuable if it is a subjective measure. So it should be something that allows for uniform interpretation, be repeatable and independent of the observer. For example, is your metric defined in the same way over time? And we often think about including a control group or baseline or some other counterfactual to estimate what would have happened in the absence of an intervention to ascertain the true effect of the intervention. Now, I can go into a whole separate hour on the topic of counterfactuals, which I won't here. So all I'm asking is to be aware of that concept. Third, your outcome needs to be collectible. So think how you can collect the data, preferably at minimal costs and readily available so that your metric can be a good indicator of progress made. Last, but certainly not least, your metric should be simple. Don't try to overcomplicate it because you need to easily communicate both the results and by the person, whether yourself or other party, to collect the data in order to keep track of progress. We'll go through a case study later in the session to apply all of this into practice, so don't worry. But before we do, I've been asked by my colleague Rob from the Social Impact Hub to address the question of how outcomes measurement relate to social impact investments, as there may be an interest to the audience. Probably remiss of me if I don't briefly cover it, given the name of my team is Office of Social Impact Investments. So let me start with some definitions again in terms of what I mean by the concept of social impact investing. So at a high level, social impact investments encourage innovative ways to deliver better social and financial outcomes for individuals, families, and communities. It brings together the public, private, and non-government sectors to address and solve social challenges. So the diagram up here on the left provides a very simplified overview of how social impact investing works for my team. So there may be investors who provide upfront funding for the delivery of social services. The service providers, such as an NGO, would use that investor funding or their own funding to deliver on their agreed social outcomes. And as a result of the services delivered by the service provider, people's lives improve as they receive better or more efficient and effective service. So this generates savings for government, and these savings are used to pay the service providers and investors. So governments participate in social impact investing as commissioners of outcomes. And because of that dynamic, outcomes measurement is at the heart of social impact investing, because for investors, outcomes measurement help them make informed investment decisions and assess whether they are getting the social return they are seeking along with that financial return. For service providers, keeping track of outcomes help them determine how well their program is performing, and if not, drive adaptation and iteration of the program to improve. For government, and I mentioned that earlier, achieving outcomes is the basis for making outcome payments. So it is important that outcomes can be robustly measured and verified. So you're probably curious now whether the program that your organization is running is suitable for this type of social impact investment. The answer to that depends on quite a few things, including where your organization is at and future aspirations. So my team, the Office of Social Impact Investment, or OSII as we like to call ourselves, developed 3 separate modules to help organizations assess and develop their social impact investment proposal. They are online and free on our OSII website, so please feel free to check them out. For the purpose of this session though, I will only cover the high-level essential elements of our social impact investment framework so that you are aware, and I'll leave it completely up to you whether you want to explore this further. So broadly, there are 3 elements which makes up our social impact investment framework. They are 1, defining the program, 2, providing a solution, and 3, addressing feasibility. So when developing a social impact investment proposal, you should consider the social issue you are looking to address, and if the social issue is suitable for social impact investment. And there are 2 main factors that can help you decide this. Firstly, social issues that are suitable for social impact investing are generally pressing social issues that government and non-government sectors can't solve alone. Secondly, when assessing if your issue is suitable, it is useful to consider the following factors. So, A, is there a gap in the current service provision? B, is there a growing social need affecting many people? And C, are there opportunities to innovate? You will also need to consider who is the target cohort for your service or program. So what I mean by target cohort, it is the group of people identified as having a set of shared characteristics and at whom a service could be aimed. So the target cohort needs to be objectively identified. So this means there should be a set of eligibility criteria for the service. Considerations should also be given to the size of the target cohort. So the target cohort should ideally be sufficiently large to necessitate a dedicated service and also small enough to observe improvements from the service. For the second component of our social impact investment framework, which is about providing a solution, we will look specifically at the elements of the proposed service. What are your targeted outcomes, and the different forms of evidence that can be used to substantiate your outcomes. So that's mainly the theory we covered earlier in developing your program logic and outcome metrics. So I won't go over that again. The last component of our social impact investment framework is about addressing feasibility. So this includes consideration of your organizational capability to develop and deliver social impact investment. So things like, do I have the necessary skills in-house or are there gaps? Should these be filled in-house or buying in expertise? What partnerships are required? For example, engaging with intermediaries. Have these services been factored into the costing? You will also need to consider elements of financial assessment necessary to understand whether your social impact investment proposal is feasible and financially viable. But as I said earlier, though, I'm just giving you a bit of a teaser on what components you need to consider when assessing whether your program is suitable for social impact investing. Outcomes measurement is an important component, but not the only consideration. So if you're interested to learn more, please feel free to check out our online modules at our OSII website. In the meantime, though, if I can bring us back to the topic on outcomes measurement specifically, the journey to outcomes measurement doesn't necessarily end after you design it. Often it can be an iterative process because social problems are complex. And as you learn and collect more evidence, you can refine your program logic and design as appropriate. Your approach to outcomes measurement should also be reflective of your specific goals, objectives, and capabilities. Sometimes it may not be possible to strive for the gold standard in outcomes measurement for pragmatic reasons, and that's okay. And finally, it's important to remember to be practical. If you're starting out on this journey, why not start small? Start by just tracking your activities, then your expected outcomes, and with time, move your way from outcomes measurement to impact measurement. Those are all important components towards better understanding whether what you are doing is actually making a difference. So I might pause here and ask Rob if there are any key questions from the audience so far. Rob, you're on mute.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, thank you.
No specific questions so far. A few participants have asked, is there a copy of the slides that may be made available at the end of the session?
Absolutely, we can make that happen.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you.
Well, in that case,
Tiff, we just had a question come through.
Great. Let me.
Anya's asking, how big does your program need to be feasible for an outcomes measurement contract?
there's probably no straight guide to that question. I mean, feasibility depends on a couple of elements. One is about capability, but also about the purpose that you're trying to achieve. Obviously, if the sample size is too small, then if you are going for the gold standard of are there statistically significant difference between your intervention and control group, then that sample size needs to be a little bit bigger. But if you're only about showing your value and measuring kind of your progress, then I think that shouldn't be I guess front of mind. It really should be tailored towards the resources that you have, your capability, but also what's the objective, what's the intended audience that you want to track outcomes measurement. To give an example, for our social impact investments that we run, it is of the vicinity around 500 all the way to a couple of thousand people. But again, that has a slightly different purpose. But to give you an idea, that's the typical kind of range that we are currently working with.
And Tiphanie, Tanya also asked, what is too small a sample size? Are you able to give any guidance around that?
So if we are going to be technically correct, there are, I guess, power analysis that could be done. So I don't want to go kind of too technical, but obviously if it's 1 or 2, then you can't really be sure whether it is just because of their particular individual circumstances that you're seeing the effect. Sometimes in that case, a couple of hundred might be better, but 20, 30 could also be sufficient depending on what exactly are you tracking. So I know it's not a specific answer, but it really depends on the your circumstances that you're trying to achieve.
Great, thank you. And then we have one from Parental EQ, just around the role of Treasury and government in impact measurement and investment. Just getting a bit of a sense around, to what extent do you set the rules and guidelines around this? Do you advise and invest, and who else you work with in the ecosystem? So maybe just providing a bit of broader context around your role in the sector would be helpful.
Yeah, sure. Thank you for that question. So we work on, I guess, government-initiated social impact investment, and generally it is a formal procurement process where we call out for the market to come to us with a proposal. In deciding whether, what policy areas that we select, we work very closely with our agency, our line agency. So, depending on the topic, if it's mental health, for example, then it will be with our Ministry of Health colleagues, because they have the policy expertise to know whether there is a need for social impact investing. In terms of the rules and guidelines, look, we publish a lot of supporting materials. So I mentioned earlier that I very briefly went through the social impact investment framework into developing a social impact investment proposal. So that are some guidelines where we want to see outcomes measured, robust outcomes measurement. We want to see that there's value for money for us to kind of pursue the project, and in terms of how we work with the ecosystem. The gist of social impact investment is about collaboration and partnership. The issues that we generally look at is about those complex, wicked social problems that none of us can really solve alone. So if there are opportunities to innovate, to intervene early, for example, then that are, I guess, some of the high-level elements to guide our thinking process. But we very much work collaboratively, both internally within government, with our line agency partners, but also with the not-for-profit sectors, the intermediaries, to make sure that when we, depending on the stage of that, when we're developing those proposals and it goes to the next stage, developing it collaboratively together to make sure that our interests are aligned and that we can maximize the impact together.
Wonderful. Thank you, Tiffany. There are a few other questions coming through. I'm just in the interest of time, perhaps we should move on to the case study, and then what we'll do, we'll have some time at the end just to come back and revisit some of those questions. So thanks for your patience, everyone, and we'll come to those towards the end of the session.
Thank you, Rob. In that case, the next segment is to break up into smaller groups to work on the case study that we have sent to you in advance. There are two exercises, one on program logic and the other on applying the ROCS principles to define your outcome metric. So just to give everyone the opportunity and exposure of the thinking process. After each exercise, we will regroup to go through a model answer together. So don't worry too much about the writing up or if you don't have all the answer. The objective is just to have a go and start having conversations. So just to set the scene, the case study here is a hypothetical. So it's not a real organization, it's just for education purposes. But just imagine you are a not-for-profit called Breaking the Cycle, or BTC. So BTC would like to support parolees who are of medium, high or high risk of reoffending because they have seen from research that parolees are 2.5 times more likely to reoffend in the first 3 months after being released from prison. They have designed a 2-year wraparound program where caseworkers will support parolees reintegrate into the community. So BTC believes their program can reduce reoffending by 5% compared with a historical baseline to help improve community safety. So the first exercise is using this information. Tell us the story of what BTC intends to achieve in a program logic. You'll be working in groups of 3 for about 15 minutes. And after that, we will regroup to go through a model answer together. So again, please don't worry about the write-up. Just use the time to familiarize yourself with the structure and have a robust discussion within your groups using the prompting questions I've included at the top of the table. Jess, if you can kindly facilitate the breakout, please. So a message should hopefully pop out soon to allocate everyone into groups. And I'll see everyone in 15 minutes.
No worries. Thanks, Tiffany. I will now put you all into breakout rooms.
Just a reminder, the materials were also shared on the email prior to the event. So if you need a copy offline, you should be able to get those. If any problem, just send us a message.
Yep. I've also added into the chat box if anyone hasn't received that for any reason as well. Tiffany, over to you.
Thank you so much, Jess. Welcome back, everyone. I hope you had a good discussion. So up here on the screen is really one possible set of answers to BTC's program logic. There could be other answers as well, as long as a strong logic or rationale can be articulated. In this answer guide, though, the underlying issue that BTC is trying to address, so in the yellow column here, is about reducing reoffending, because research is saying that parolees are 2.5 times more likely to reoffend in the first 3 months after being released from prison. What goes into BTC's proposed intervention would be the caseworkers assessing eligibility of parolees and having strong management, monitoring and reporting mechanisms. The activities would be delivering the program to the eligible parolees, ensuring appropriate training is delivered to caseworkers, and the logistics of referring eligible parolees into the program where they need to be assessed by corrective services as being medium, high and high risk of reoffending. The outputs delivered in the short term are the wraparound support to the eligible parolees, with the intended outcomes being reduced reoffending rates, for example, achieving stable housing and employment as important indicators of how successfully parolees reintegrate back into the community. And the long-term change or impact, which is at the end of the table, is ultimately improved community safety because people are not reoffending. So I hope that makes sense to everyone, and that some of the discussion, your discussion in the breakout groups, touch on some of these elements. As I said earlier, though, there could be other interpretations. The key is really able to articulate the causal link and logic clearly. Now, if we move on to the next exercise, which is about designing the outcomes measurement for BTC, you can see here I've extracted in the left-hand column the 3 targeted outcomes that I outlined in the earlier program logic in this table here. So this second exercise is about defining a suitable outcome metric against each of those outcomes. So we'll be looking to apply the ROCS principle here. And just to kick us off again, I've included an example for the first outcome, which is about reducing the reoffending rate. So let's go through that together before we break out. So in a way, as you apply the ROCS principle, you are iterating on the outcome metrics. So for example, your first draft of the metric could be about a person not reincarcerated 12 months following release from custody. And that will satisfy the relevant component because reincarceration is directly related to interactions with the justice system. But reincarceration may attract different nuances. So for example, an offender may have committed a new and proven offence, but not yet sentenced. So to make the metric more objective, we can refine the earlier outcome metric to be about a person not reincarcerated for a court finalised new offence 12 months following release from prison. Next, we consider how and when data will be collected. So based on the early information, we know that in this hypothetical example, corrective services collects data on reoffending rates. And let's assume that they do that every 12 months. If we determine that we can readily get access to that data set, we can further refine the earlier outcome metric to say a person not reincarcerated for a court finalised new offence 12 months following release from a custody compared to a historical baseline. The final check is this metric is simple to communicate and understand, and I hope that we can reasonably answer that is yes, based on that new description. So the task for everyone now is to step through a similar thinking process for the other 2 outcomes. So I'll pass to Jess if you can start allocating people in the same group for the first exercise to continue that thinking process, and I'll see everyone in 15 minutes. Over to you, Jess.
No worries. Let me break you out into your groups.
Do we have an idea of the number of people we should keep an eye out, or should I?
You've got all participants returned now.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. Okay, well, welcome back again, everyone. I hope you had a good discussion. Up here on the screen is a model answer for the first 2 outcome metrics regarding stable housing and employment. And again, other interpretations are absolutely possible, so please keep that in mind. So for the stable housing outcome, we assume that parolees are less likely to reoffend if they are in stable housing, such as in social housing and private rental. And we believe that 12 months is a good proxy towards stable housing. So putting those elements together, a possible metric could be 12 months sustained accommodation, including tenancies under social housing and private leases. that is relatively objective because social housing and private leases are well defined. You can seek access to the lease agreement and register bill as data to verify that outcome. However, I should flag that there are obviously privacy considerations and how to go about collecting those data without intruding or negatively impacting on your clients. So please take that into consideration. Assuming that is all fine, for the final check, the metric of 12 months sustained accommodation, including tenancies under social housing, private leases, appear relatively simple to communicate and understand. So moving on to the stable employment outcome, I guess it's an assumption that you've got to make that, we assume that an individual working for 14 hours per week for a sustained period of 6 months are strong proxies for stable employment. You may want to test that assumption though. So you may want to play around the sustained period by also adding the 3 months and the 12 months to keep track of progress and what happens beyond that 6 months hypothesis. Average hours per week or over a set period of time is probably as objective as you can get. In terms of how to verify this, you may be able to collect data on clients' pay slips or timesheets from their employments every quarter. But again, you need to think about any client and privacy considerations and work through that carefully. Assuming that all works out fine, the metric about a person working on average, for example, at least 14 more hours per week for a sustained period of 3, 6, 12 months is relatively simple to communicate and understand. So I guess that's a quick run through of one possible set of answers to those outcome metrics. You can see that there are additional practical considerations such as privacy, client needs and consent that you will need to capture and work through. But I hope this exercise gives you a bit of a flavor into the thinking process, particularly in applying the Welks principle, and to highlight the sometimes iterative nature of this process. So with that in mind, I might open up and invite Rob back to tell me if there are any questions from the audience that we didn't get time to before it broke out, or any new questions that have come to light, and we can do some Q&A.
Great, thanks, Tiffany. We have a couple here, and I'll just run through each of them. The first is around just reflecting on those exercises and that methodology. Can you provide some advice on how organisations can kind of take what they've learned today and then start applying it to their own organisations?
Yeah, absolutely. Great question. I mean, hopefully, design the content to be as practical as possible. So I hope, you can start applying, how to articulate your program or service in a program logic format, tell your story, but able to, I guess, articulate and communicate the causal links between your activities and outputs all the ways into outcomes and impact. You're very much welcome to hopefully apply that relatively simple, I guess, acronym of ROCKS, when designing your outcome metrics. But I guess to get to that, it depends on perhaps think about where your organization is at. Do you have the right infrastructure in place? So depending how big your organization is, you might want to first think about, do you have the right governance and the resources to do it? Be very clear about the objective you're trying to do and the intended audience. Because if you are just, if the purpose of measuring outcomes is purely from the perspective of, learning what you are doing and seeing, iterating based on the data that you are collecting, then kind of that level of threshold, because it's still kind of internal facing, will be a lot less if you are, as a comparison, on the other hand, trying to appeal to, impact investors to invest in your program, or even apply for a social impact investment with the government. I guess there are a spectrum of layers of what you're trying to do, and absolutely tailor your outcomes, approach the outcome measurement to what your needs are, your goals, and also your capabilities. So I'll kind of remind my earlier slide about kind of the things to remember. Definitely be practical. If you're only just starting out, start somewhere small and build your way up to measuring outcomes and impact.
Wonderful, thanks, Tiff. And another question in relation to social impact investing. The question is, how are commercial measures balanced with the social impact measures when identifying suitability for impact investment?
Yeah, no, thank you. Great question. So when we go out so this is a request for proposal process, so calling out from social impact investment proposal from the market, we are very clear in our RFP documents the evaluation criteria of what we are looking for, and definitely kind of that commercial elements need to balance out. There's a value proposition criteria, for example, in terms of what is it that your program in terms of the risk and return profile. So just to unpack that a little bit more, if your program is like super innovative and there isn't a lot of evidence to know, whether it would succeed, for example, in the context or the type of cohort you're working with, then the level of risk exposure on this kind of not working is probably high, in which case the return expected for that, if an investor was going to invest in it, the expectation of return will probably be a lot higher as opposed to, a program where you have a pretty good confidence that is going to work. So that commercial measure or that balancing act isn't static. It is bespoke to the investment structure. It is bespoke to the program, your cohort, and also the setting that you're working with. But certainly, we've published quite a lot of kind of supporting materials to kind of help proponents assess that on our OSII website. So very much welcomed to browse through those materials.
Thank you. The next question, somebody made an observation that a number of government grants are for non-profit organisations, and they were wondering whether we may see a change towards social enterprises being more eligible for certain government grants in the future.
Thank you, Rob. So just to be clear, my team doesn't specifically focus on grants. But I guess generally speaking, I think that observation is correct. And I guess part of my other work that we're doing is trying to move away from that, because I think especially with COVID, there's definitely an increasing recognition and appreciation of the important role that social enterprises play. But moving that dial and that kind of understanding within government is incremental, is a work in progress. But kind of one small move towards that. So a recent initiative that was released by Department of Education, which our team supported them on, is the Youth Employment Social Impact Program. And it specifically calls out social enterprises to take part, in that process. So it's a small change, but hopefully I am really hopeful that there is a growing and gradual shift towards, providing greater recognition and call out of the social enterprise sector over time.
Great, thank you, Tiffany. We have a couple more questions coming through on the chat. We might have time to get to these three, hopefully. The first is how social enterprises can calculate this impact in terms of financial terms to comply with the minimum 50% of annual profit tied to purpose.
Oh, that's a hard one. So I guess there is an element about, monetizing or quantifying those benefits. And at a high level, there are intermediaries like, social traders and B Corp that, I think that particular criteria is the social traders definition. And, they, assess that on whether, that could be satisfied. But I guess at a high level, and I'm just flicking back so that I can see the questions carefully. The financial terms, there is probably no one answer, but towards, I guess, getting to that stage where ultimately, it satisfy or give confidence that it would comply with that minimum 50% of annual profits, having the outcomes measurement framework in place helps with some of the articulation. So if you are thinking about, because impact or outcomes, there are two dimensions. One is obviously the depth of your, so the degree of your change, and also there's a time period. So time period in the sense that can you sustain the estimate time period that your outcome would have lasted, for X period, because it doesn't, I guess it's a less impactful in a way to if a person, for example, cycles in and out of, I don't know, temporary accommodation, for example. Having that infrastructure set up so that you are clear on what is it that you are focusing on, and then quantifying that in terms of the benefits. So benefits can be a variety of different ways. So it can be personal benefits, but also benefits to, this is depending on audience, like say the state government, because if you are able to change that life trajectory of the person, then presumably the service usage costs for that person, it doesn't get reached the stage of acute services, then there will be savings, I guess, that would be that could be quantified from that respect. So long-winded answer is there is no one way, but you have to have the infrastructure in place to know exactly what is it that you are focusing on in terms of your change in order to quantify that effectively.
Brilliant, thank you. And just in the interest of time, I might just bring these two together. The first is just some high-level guidance on how you would approach government for social impact investment. Are there any resources or links that you could share? And just second is, what are some of the short, mid-term priorities for OSII? What are your next priority areas, etc.?
Sure, thank you for that. For the first half of that question, we have a lot of materials I mentioned that we have made publicly available on our OSII website. So things like, technical guide to outcomes measurement. There is that online module that I refer to, which I understand Jess has shared that link to the audience. So the first module is a little bit about, what is social impact investment? And then it goes to the second and third, fourth module, kind of specific questions to ask yourself as you develop your proposal. There is a tab where we also, as an archive, all our previous request for proposal documents. You can have a look to just kind of get a flavor of the evaluation criteria, just to kind of get a better sense of what is expected. And of course, our 8 investments that we have developed, all that information is up on our OSII website as well, including their evaluation report. So that, I guess, should give you a good grasp of what we do and what we look for. In relation to the second part of that question around OSII's focus, look, at the moment, I think COVID has been a really interesting year. I think we are, certainly, want to make sure that there are service continuity for our programs to date. And, it's probably not a surprise that COVID has an impact. I guess more, forward looking, I think I might need to, not a cop out, but I might need to say that you need to keep your eye out on our OSII website on specific initiatives, and I encourage you to sign up on our OSII mailing list, because whenever we announce a particular initiative and focus area, we make that available on our mailing list. But it wouldn't be a surprise necessarily, given our COVID environment, that jobs and employment are of particularly interest to us. So, those in the audience, employment-focused social enterprises, I think that, reasonably say that would be of interest for OSII. But for specific details, please keep an eye out on our OSII website.
Wonderful. Thank you, Tiffany. And that brings us on to time. So just thank you everyone for joining us this afternoon for this workshop. And a big thank you. Please join me in thanking Tiffany for taking the time to share her expertise around outcomes measurement. I've definitely learned a lot myself and hope you all did as well. Just a quick reminder, this is actually part of a series of workshops that Social Impact Hub are hosting over the coming months. So if you're interested in joining other sessions, we have a whole variety from leadership sessions, marketing, branding, strategy. Please jump on the Social Impact Hub website and sign up. The next one's around strategy and action, which is next Friday at the same time. And we will make sure that we put together the materials from this session and send them out to everyone. So thank you everyone for attending, and thanks again for Tiffany and Jess for all the support on the session, and enjoy the rest of your afternoon and weekends, everyone.
Thank you all.
Thank you.